Welcome. Happy Thursday. Thank you to those of you who have been here all week, and welcome to some new faces who are joining us for the first time. We're really grateful to have all of you here. The students who have been giving talks this week are a part of the capstone class. So just as a very quick little intro for those of you who might be on your first day here, in capstone, students get to choose an area of personal interest that they spend the whole semester learning about. And we learn about it in a variety of different ways. We do a lot of research. We consider different viewpoints on the topic. They have to write a big research paper. We continue our exploration and learning in a project that the students have to create themselves and then actually do. And then the last thing that we do is we share what we have learned with our community through these talks. So we've had 6 good talks already, and we're going to have another 3 good ones today. Chris is going to start us off by talking about money and economics. The main feedback I've given him all semester is, please make it more simple. I still don't understand what you're talking about. And I think he's done a really nice job of making his ideas very accessible for us. So hopefully you'll be able to follow along. Then Dom's going to talk about toxic relationships, which is a really popular term these days, but is actually a little bit hard to pin down exactly what it means or what we should do about it. So I find his talk helpful in kind of wrapping our heads around that. And then Keiryn is going to close us off with a look at sort of exactly the very thing we've been doing over the last 3 days of learning more through this kind of TED-style talk. And so I think that her talk will give some really interesting perspective to the very exercise that we're doing together. So I really hope you enjoy these 3 talks, and you can join me in welcoming Chris to the stage.
Hello? All right. What if human life was represented by a number? Or what if a person was just another data point, a variable, some cost in a study? In September of 1970, Ford released its newest model car, the Ford Pinto. It was prided as one of the first subcompact vehicles produced by an American favorite brand. This means that the car was cheap, it was light, and it could take on the Japanese and foreign cars taking over the car market at the time. But the Ford Pinto came with a small problem. You see, the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration, NHTSA for short, states that cars in the market should probably not explode into flames in the case of a rear-end crash. Problem with the Ford Pinto, however, or more precisely its fuel system, was it had a tendency to blow up into flames in the case of a rear-end crash. So Ford puts its new Pinto through these crash tests, but all its results are returning red. This was obviously a dangerous car. But if Ford were to recall its model, not only will it cost the company money and its American favorite reputation, but by next year, the Ford companies would have already taken over the car market. So what should the company do? Ford decides anything to secure the bag. Ford conducts an internal and secret study infamously titled Fatalities Associated with Crash-Induced Fuel Leakage and Fires. In this study, Ford calculated that it was more economic to let its ticking death machine roam around the roads rather than admit the mistake. This study would later be uncovered, and Ford will be charged in court for homicide. And to this day, the Pinto is synonymous with the words cheap and dangerous. Now, in my life, I was always a pastor's kid, so these kinds of businesses and companies didn't mean much to me. What did matter a lot to me, or at least in that field, was money. Money was certainly nice to have. A lot of it meant I could buy a new PlayStation or new Nike shoes. But I didn't need an economics class to see how money influences the world around us. Already around us are people poorer than us and richer than us. And these things are defined uniquely by everyone through different jobs, different backgrounds, different personalities. And I could see that as a pastor's kid when people ate different kinds of foods, wore different kinds of clothes, and lived in different kinds of houses. So food, clothes, houses, money gets you all these things. But what is money? Think of it this way. Back in old civilization, early civilization, people traded for things. Let's say for a while that I'm a fisherman and I wanted wheat. I would go to my local wheat farmer and trade some of my fish for his wheat. This kind of exchange was called a bartering system. But running on a bartering system got hard when I wanted fish, but the wheat farmer doesn't want fish from me. Sorry, I wanted wheat, but the farmer doesn't want my fish. So I offered the farmer a new deal. I offered the farmer, in exchange for his wheat, and promised him an equivalent amount of good or service. And I'll mark this kind of promise on currencies like seeds, seashells, coins, and finally, paper currency. Holding a certain amount of currency represented an amount I promised and owe to the farmer. And when civilization, oh, by the way, my bad, I forgot about this. And when civilization advanced into international trading, these kinds of commodities that used to be, these kinds of currencies like the seashells that were backed up by commodities like salt, farm animals, and, like I said, seashells, were simplified by gold and silver. Gold and silver became the currency of the world, where amassing as much of these precious metals translate directly into a measure of one's wealth. Now, say I live during this time and I have a stash of gold. It's not really safe of me to try and keep this gold for myself and protect it by my own will, right? So I think of a new idea. I tell my neighbors, hey, I'll start a safe house. I'll make a business out of keeping your gold safe. So system is very simple. You deposit some gold into my safe, and I'll signify how much gold is accredited to your name on like a special piece of paper. So that way, the next time you come to my safe house, I'll exchange the paper for the equivalent amount of gold you deposited earlier. It's a simple system, but as people got lazy having to come back to my safe house every time they wanted to buy something and having to exchange gold for paper, I just see people are just starting to exchange these special pieces of paper instead of gold. So if the people aren't coming back for the gold and I'm just sitting there with a bunch of other people's gold, I get a new idea. I can make money out of this. You see, it's not my gold, but no one's coming back for it, so why should I just let it sit there and sleep? What I should do is I can take the gold and loan it out to people in interest rates. That way I can only gain gold, right? I can gain more money. And this got to the point where I didn't even need other people's gold to back up these values that I'm loaning out. I could just make up a loan and just charge interest. It'll be fine, and I just make more money. This simplifies the majority of today's modern banking systems. But before you knew all that, high schoolers might remember a little survey I sent out a few weeks ago about money. I asked you guys a little bit about your background information, a few hypothetical prompts about finances, and a scale to sort of get a sense of your guys' economic political direction. So here's some stats I want to show you guys. So the bar graph over there, the column graph, was when I asked our international community, of course, what kind of culture you guys are affiliated towards. 1 was Western, and 4 was Eastern. And I tried to do Western Eastern, but I realized that this question is not that straight of an answer, so I put a scale of 1 through 4. And I'm very glad to see that a lot of you guys believe that you're not just one culture, you guys are a mix of it. However, it did make my study a bit harder, I won't lie. The pie graph below there was when I asked you guys to rate your guys' financial status as a household. Now, I did not expect you guys to actually calculate money and stuff. I just wanted your guys' perception. And I kind of expected this, but 48%, the largest proportion of the other options, stated that you guys were middle class. Okay. Some more background information, I asked you guys, how often do you talk about money economics? Again, the middle scale, which was a monthly occasion. And family members, please take note of this. Almost 65%, the majority of high school said they talk to parents and family the most about money economics. So that's the survey part. Let's look a little bit about the stats part. Now, in table 1, what I did was I took some of that profile information and I compared it to the few hypothetical prompts about finances. In this case, I compared, the financial status, how you guys perceive yourselves. And you can see that trend that goes up linearly, where as people believe they were wealthier, they were more prone to answering towards a libertarian perception. Now, I realize I didn't give much context about the questions, but actually this is more towards the high schoolers. I'm so sorry for non-high school kids. Now, in table 2, I included this because Mr. Kilgo wants me to address the realism of statistics, where you don't usually get what you always want. In this case, I compared the information you guys gave me about how often you talk about money compared to the same questions about hypothetical prompts about finances. And you can see here, there is absolutely no trend at all. Funny, and like I said, you guys kind of make the study part of the statistics hard for me. And I wish I had a better conclusion for this, but that's not the point I'm showing you guys this. What I really wanted high school students to think about was, what does money mean to you? I alluded previously about how reality shows us a world abundant in economic disparity. Some people are richer than others, and some countries are wealthier than others. But I also alluded to strategies that private companies, like my Safe House, innovated to find new ways to grow wealth. These two regards translate directly into how individuals, we who make up a community, can benefit ourselves and others economically. Let's think back to the Safe House. Within the persons, there's an innate desire to profit. I feel this is a fair statement. But when I say profit, some people automatically think about the game Monopoly, where the objective of the game is to gather capital and accumulate money out the hands of competitors. That's understandable, but that's not quite the right idea. Instead, think of it this way. Let's say I invent a robot that does all the chores in the house. Of course, parents and lazy children would really want to buy this robot. In economic terms, this means that the robot is in high demand. And as the demand of the robot gets high, I want to produce more supply of the robot to match this growing demand, because selling more robots equals making more profit. And as my business grows, my rich friends, who for their own well-being recognize, hey, this robot business is making a lot of money. So they offer to invest in my company. They offer to help me build factories, develop technology, and commit some of their own money in exchange for some of the profits I make. In this case, both parties get to profit. The idea to highlight here is that money flows where the market demands. The libertarian perception of money emphasizes how an economy left hands-free of intervention will produce what is best for society via trends, whether that be the best trade of goods and services, or develop an industry to meet its best demands. Take Apple, for example. The inflated demand for iPhones motivated Apple to go from its first iPhone to the iPhone 14 Pro Max today. Quite the progress of technology. And in today's smartphone industry, there are large competitors like Samsung and Huawei who, competing with Apple to try to make money, have developed yearly flagship technologies such as the Galaxy Ultra 22 and the Mate Pro 50. That's good and all, but the problem is, not all of us are Steve Jobs or Tim Cook. So on the other hand, the socialistic perception of money critiques how letting money dictate the trends of society denies what makes up a society in the first place, the people. Take Google, for example. Google has made a universe of information accessible to anyone with the internet. This was made possible by private investors who believed that this ambitious search engine could grow into the lucrative business that it is today. But what can an economy like this do for, say, everyone's education? Because it is not a realistic justification to suggest that people can get a sufficient education through just YouTube and Google that will at least secure them a future stable life in this world. Why? Because Apple wouldn't consider hiring someone with no degree or no experience. This kind of prejudice, this kind of bias happens elsewhere in the world, where the economy fails to meet less tangible needs for its people. Research and investments in medicines like the COVID-19 vaccines ballooned due to the extreme demands. But what about the less common diseases or the more expensive cancers? A 2015 Northwestern medicine study shows us how poorly funded lungs and pancreatic cancers are compared to how common they are and how many deaths they cause. Can money take care of needs like these appropriately? So which is it? Is an economy more beneficial when individuals are entitled to private use of their money? Or is establishing a welfare system that takes care of the disadvantaged better? Trying to justify and define the moral use of money is not a black and white answer. Or else why would there be scary images of capitalism and socialism if not real examples that have tried to take them into the extreme? The inhumane working conditions in the beginnings of the industrial age and the fall of communist empires, we saw the 16-hour workdays compared to eliminating the private ownership of property. These are failures of economies that have prioritized is philosophy over the people. Now, I'm not saying you have to try and choose one side, but instead, think critically on how you use money. The more stupid thing to do here is to use money without a direction or thought. Think what the money you're using actually is and why you use that money. Franklin P. Adams, an American columnist in the 1900s, summarizes it neatly. Money isn't everything, but a lack of money isn't anything. What does money mean to you? And ask yourself, does that definition serve money? Or rather, how can money serve you? Thank you.
Are you is this is this working? Are you toxic? Take a moment to think about that question. Odds are you probably said that you weren't, which is fair. But now take a moment to think about what came to mind when I asked you that question. How did you decide whether or not you were toxic? Was it based on your past actions? Or perhaps it was from just how you felt in the moment? Well, that's a tough question to answer, but it's a question that I'm going to try to answer today as I give my talk. In fact, I want everyone here to continue thinking about that question as I give my talk today. I think it's safe for me to assume that everyone in this hall is familiar with the term toxic relationships, or at the very least, unhealthy relationships. When you try to search out what a toxic relationship is, you're often given a list of feelings rather than definitions. Typical answers you get are relationships that make you feel unsupported, misunderstood, demeaned, or attacked. Those are the answers that you get when you click on the first link when you make a quick Google search on the topic. So let's take a small step away from toxic relationships and talk about feelings for a second. It's no secret that feelings and emotions are some of the key aspects of the human condition. And because of this, whether we like it or not, feelings control our behavior much more than we think. It's the basis of our subconscious and affects us throughout the day, even now, as you're sitting in this hall listening to these talks. However, because of how big of a part feelings play in our lives, we often forget that everyone experiences the world differently and therefore experiences feelings very differently as well. Oftentimes, because of how big of an impact feelings play in a person's life, they forget that the same things that make them feel a certain way don't necessarily make everyone else feel the same way as well. And this applies to toxic relationships as well. Toxic relationships are very subjective. Something that is considered toxic to one person may not necessarily be considered toxic to anyone else. One popular example is the different styles of parenting. Some parents might think that it's okay to use physical disciplinary measures to keep their kids disciplined and in line and wouldn't hesitate to raise their voice to scold their children, whereas some other parents would frown upon that behavior and would even consider it as domestic or child abuse. And the main takeaway from that is what I said before, which is that people can experience the same thing very differently, in this case, parenting. So you might ask, aren't toxic relationships just any relationship that makes one or both sides of the relationship, where one or both sides of the relationship aren't healthy? Well, that's exactly what it is. But what's important for us to realize here is what causes a relationship to be considered toxic. Over the course of this semester, as I thought about that question, I came to realize that I needed to get more opinions from people in person rather than online. So I came up with the plan to interview a professional on the subject and then go out in public and interview some random people on the street about it. The first part of my project was to go and interview a professional. Thankfully, my parents work in a hospital, and I managed to set up an interview with a psychologist who has had decades of experience in the field. And I managed to gain valuable insight from those interviews. The next part of my project, however, didn't go as planned. When I tried to interview random people on the street, not a single person said yes to being interviewed. When I thought going to Gurney on a Sunday afternoon, when it would be fully packed, would be the best time to get people to say yes to getting interviewed, but unfortunately, not a single person said yes. So I moved on to my next best option, the community that I'm part of. I ended up choosing several random Dalat seniors to interview on my topic. This didn't go as bad as I thought, because seniors in Dalat would have had a wide range of experiences being TCKs, and most of them would also be almost or over the age of 18, the age at which most would consider teens become adults. And since I was going to compile these interviews into a short video, I had to make the questions quick and short. So I asked them the following questions. How would you define a toxic relationship? What examples could you give of a toxic relationship? Could you share any personal experiences of toxic relationships? And what advice could you give to someone who is currently in a toxic relationship? The main thing that I learned after conducting all these interviews was that the main thing that I learned from all these interviews was that the same thing that caused one person that one person considers toxic may not necessarily be considered toxic to anyone else. And something else that I also realized as I was conducting these interviews was that almost always, when talking about a topic like this, people are referring to romantic relationships. We have to keep in mind that toxic relationships can apply to almost any kind of interpersonal relationship. That includes romantic relationships. That also includes parental, professional, platonic, and almost any kind of interpersonal relationship you can think of. Along with this, I started to compile a 3,000-word essay, during which I came across a statistic that over 1/3 of all teens have experienced some sort of toxic or unhealthy relationship with a peer. This information shocked me, but it didn't at the same time. So as I thought about this question, I came to realize this was because of how sheltered and protected the environment of Dalat was. It's not a problem that students in Dalat have to deal with regularly, or at least appear so. And I'm not saying it doesn't happen. It very likely does. But what my point here is that it doesn't happen to students here as much as it does to students outside of Dalat. Dalat would seem to be very sheltered from these kinds of situations, which is a good thing. But it also brings problems of its own. Students wouldn't know how to cope with these kinds of problems after they graduate and go off on their own, which is another reason why I felt it was so important to bring awareness to a topic like this to our community. People affected by toxic relationships often have long-term, large negative effects sticking with them. The most common and most well-known is on your mental health. In a study by Laguna in 2022, it states that unhealthy relationships may contribute to a toxic social environment that can lead to stress, depression, anxiety, and even suicide. Evidence from this article also supports another statistic that says that over 80% of young adults who have experienced some sort of toxic or abusive relationship in their youth met criteria for at least one psychiatric disorder at age 21. There is also a strong correlation between unhealthy and abusive relationship to suicide rates. Studies show that rate may even be up to 200% higher. Similarly, in another article by Washaw in 2014, he states that there is now a fairly large body of research demonstrating that survivors of domestic violence are at greater risk for experiencing a range of mental health conditions such as depression, PTSD, suicidality, as well as substance abuse disorders. These mental health issues would then lead to secondary issues, particularly physical health issues, something that is talked about much less when talking about a topic like this. People with underlying mental health conditions are much more likely to be diagnosed with diseases such as cardiovascular disease or diabetes. All of this will lead a person down a path with very undesirable outcomes. So what can you do if you are in a toxic relationship? Well, if you're asking that question, then that means you've already passed the first and hardest step to begin with. That is, being aware and accepting that you're in that position. From here, there are two options that you can take. You either stay in the relationship or you leave the relationship altogether. You might think it's impossible to stay in a toxic relationship, but in actuality, it very much is, although oftentimes unlikely. In order to fix a toxic relationship, both sides must work towards a mutual acceptance of responsibility, a willingness to invest time and effort, a shift from blaming to understanding, and an openness to outside help. And probably the most important out of those four is a mutual acceptance of responsibility. This will show both sides a self-responsibility, self-awareness, and most importantly, maturity. With both parties recognizing how their actions have affected each other in the past, it will make the transition into fixing the relationship much easier. Yet, there are still situations with one or both sides of a relationship not wanting to change or not realizing and not willing to admit that they're in that situation. In situations like this, the given relationship is often cannot be fixed, and the best course of action would be to leave it altogether. Saying this, leaving any kind of relationship can be hard, even one that is toxic. Still, there are several steps that someone can take to leave a toxic relationship. Another article, different from the one I found previously, gives a list of things that someone can do. That list includes building a support system, cutting off contact, sticking with your decision, and sticking with your decision. And the article before also supports these tips. And perhaps the most important out of these three is creating a support system. Creating a support system allows the person in question to have a circle of people who they can trust and are there to support them. Having people to confide in times of stress will make this transition much easier. And they will be there to make sure that this person doesn't contact the toxic partner, fall into dangerous habits, or fall into a mental health crisis. And people who can be part of this circle can include, but are not limited to, friends, family, counselors, and most importantly, therapists. Now, saying all this makes it sound easy, but in actuality, it is harder than any of us can imagine, which is why, once again, it's so important to make a topic like this more talked about, especially in Asia, where topics like these are often considered taboo. People are not willing or don't know how to talk about topics like these, which is why, once again, it's so important to bring awareness to a topic like this. So what can you do if you know someone who is in a toxic relationship? Upon knowing that, it's equally important for all of us to be open to listening to other people's problems. If you're in a position where someone is willing to open up and share their problems with you, about their relationship or anything in life with you, take into consideration that it probably took that person an inconceivable amount of effort to confide in you, let alone share that information with you. That puts you in a special position where you can make drastic positive change to someone else's life by simply being open. And if you think that someone is being if you think that someone is in a toxic relationship but are not reaching out, simply go talk to that person. For all you know, they might be simply waiting for someone to go approach them and talk to them about that issue. Because, like I said before, a lot of times people are not willing or don't know how to reach out to talk about a problem like this. If you're in a position where one of your friends are being toxic to you or to someone around you, try talking to them. Let them know how their actions are affecting the people around them. This can potentially save a lot of people from unnecessary hurt. In fact, oftentimes conflicts can be resolved by simple dialogue. What's this? Okay. Simply put, the best thing you can do as a person in a toxic relationship, know someone in a toxic relationship, or have any issues in general, is to simply be open to communication. A simple, hey, we need to talk, can go a long way in preventing undesirable situations. At the same time, it's also important for us to realize that to understand how our actions affect other people. Something that is meaningless to someone can be the complete opposite for someone else. We shouldn't be afraid to reach out for help. It isn't a sign of weakness, but rather a sign of strength. We as a community and a society need to come together and realize that. Thank you.
Good afternoon. If you don't already know me, my name is Keiryn, and today I want to invite you to do a little metacognition. That is, to think about how you think. I sat down in capstone class way back at the beginning of the semester, and I knew I needed to pick a topic that interested me. Now, what most interests me right now is analyzing modern Western culture, because it's the culture in which I participate, and in which most of you, by being a part of this community, also participate. A culture which combines a Christian foundation with an increasingly secular European intellectual heritage. And as I sat down on the journey that I would take up to this talk, it occurred to me that something like giving a TED Talk actually happens within this cultural framework. So that's what I decided to explore. Well, not the giving of it precisely. Today, I would like to explore with you what it looks like for us as an audience to information like that in TED Talks does inside us. And I think that when it happens, we participate in two kinds of salvation. In describing this to you, I will begin at the roots and work outwards. Which reminds me, raise your hands if you were at the TED Talks yesterday. Okay? Tuesday? Both days? Okay, cool. Cast your mind back to those and see if you can remember, how did you feel while you were listening to them? Now, among the emotions you might be feeling, and this is not applicable for all of them, but for several of them, I suspect a little bit of guilt was present. A little, oh, I've been doing this wrong. For example, during Jasmine's talk about the ocean, she mentioned how part of the reason it's a problem is that a lot of people know that it's a problem but don't do anything about it, so you could feel guilty over that. Or during Natalie's, you could feel guilt over knowing that caffeine is probably harming your body, but still you are consuming it and doing that to your body. And actually a lot of information does this, not just my classmates, especially in the information age when there's so much of it. Isn't that rather funny that we seek out information that makes us feel guilty? But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let's rewind just a bit. All the way to the Renaissance, in fact, where an important strand of thinking enters Western thought. This strand of thinking is called humanism, and it's an important piece of Western philosophy. Now, when you hear that word humanism, you probably think of something like this, but actually, humanism makes claims about the world which still guide our cultural mindset today, even if we don't agree with it. Humanism emphasizes, you guessed it, humanity, specifically humanity's capabilities and creative capacity, and usually it portrays humanity as the primary agency in the world. For instance, one scholar, when describing a humanist basis for environmentalism, said that if the evident evil in worldly affairs is to be overcome apart from any redemptive divine action, then vigorous human effort will be required. This belief that vigorous human effort will be required characterizes our cultural approach to most big problems. We see humanity as responsible for solving the evident evils in the world, because of course there's nothing else that's going to do it. And then we also see humanity as capable of solving those problems. For instance, the website for the American Humanist Association claims that when people are left largely free to pursue their own interests and goals, to think and speak for themselves, to develop their abilities, and to operate in a social setting that promotes liberty, humanity moves further towards the goal of greater self-understanding, better laws, better institutions, and a good life. Basically, this is the belief that under ideal conditions, humanity's future has a positive trajectory. The goal then would be to establish those ideal conditions and therefore reach that positive trajectory. So here we have a sort of salvation doctrine on a global scale. The world is full of these evident evils, right? There's things wrong with the world. But we, as humanity, can, through our creativity and our effort, save the world from those evident evils and eventually tangibly improve it and get to a point where there is a better future, which is, of course, a salvation, a rescuing from bad to good. And depending on your beliefs, that might sound about right to you, or you might disagree with it. And if you're in the latter category, if you're wondering, like, if you're not a humanist, why should this matter to you? And what difference does it make? We'll get there. But first, I want to look at one weapon that humanity wields in the face of this struggle against the evident evils to bring about this societal salvation. Information. Hand in hand with humanist beliefs about the role of humanity in the world come beliefs about the power of information itself. I'm going to take the American Humanist Association's website again. Through this unshackled spirit of free inquiry, and this is referring to uninhibited human learning, through this unshackled spirit of free inquiry, new knowledge and new ways of looking at ourselves and the world can be acquired. Without it, we are left in ignorance and subsequently are unable to improve on our condition. I think that last sentence is the most important part, where it sets up ignorance in direct opposition to improvement. Therefore, we end up in this battleground, rather, kind of, between information and improvement and a good future, and ignorance, which is bringing about the evident evils in the world. Because, of course, the underlying assumption in a statement like that is that the biggest or a major reason why people make bad choices is because they don't know any better. Therefore, if you flip that around, if we did know better, we would make better choices. So after that long excursion into our culture's general relationship with evil, with humanity, with information, we get to the real point. What happens when this battle comes to us? We don't call this era the information age for nothing. Humanity today has a higher exposure to information than ever before. Of course, not all of it, and probably not most of it, is information relevant to changing the world. However, we still encounter plenty of it. For instance, the common term awareness raising. The fervor for awareness actually provides a pretty good example of how we use information as a weapon in this societal salvation. For instance, I read an article which opened with a rather humorous 2 paragraphs. They were list of USA calendar awareness dates for January and February alone. That's a lot. And this kind of demonstrates how our culture believes in the spreading of information as a major agent of change and improvement. And this kind of information is meant to reverse evident evils, equip us for positive change, and it naturally revolves around problems. For example, here's a fairly standard problem and solution article entitled "Why Endangered Species Matter." And of course, it sets up a problem, that there are endangered species around the world at risk of going extinct. The article then outlines that for numerous and logical reasons, this is bad. However, in doing this, it also describes the causes of animal endangerment and extinction, causes which shouldn't surprise us. Overfishing, pollution, climate change, deforestation, etc. Causes in which we, the likely readers, are complicit. By consuming the products of these industrial enterprises, we are participating in the human greed which is harming animals, as this article describes. And of course, we generally know that, even if we don't know how it applies in this particular situation. And if, as Shelby Steele, who wrote a paper which was primarily about American racial relations, however, it contained several rather universal insights into guilt itself. If, as he writes, guilt must always involve knowledge, then this is where guilt enters, where knowledge is juxtaposing our benefit with harm caused to other things, in this case, animals. I mentioned earlier that you might also have felt guilt while listening to my classmates. Isn't that kind of funny? I mean, who in here likes feeling guilty? And yet, we're a culture which encourages researching and presenting speeches like this one, which encourages listening to them, which encourages writing articles like this and finding them on the internet. You don't write things that nobody reads, theoretically. It also is a culture which encourages proliferating awareness and setting calendar awareness dates. And this is largely because of that cultural salvation I described earlier, or rather societal, not cultural. Societal salvation I described earlier, where all of this information spreading is meant to be saving humanity from the evident evils of the world and bringing them to a better future. However, this is not the only salvation that's happening when we read, watch, or take in information like this. There's a second salvation underneath it, and this one happens inside of us. It's a salvation for ourselves from the guilt and fault that we discover in the process of eradicating our ignorance on topics like these. Here's another thing Steele said about guilt. What makes it so powerful is the element of fear of what the guilty knowledge says about us. Guilt makes us afraid for ourselves. Normally, we like to think of ourselves, if not as good people, at least as good enough people. And information like present in my example article suggests that because there are consequences to our choices, that these might then be bad choices. And if we make bad choices, might we then be bad people? Especially if we overrun that assumption that you wouldn't do it if you didn't know better by knowing better. Oh, yes. So if we then feel that maybe we are bad people, that's kind of an uncomfortable feeling. And while we are feeling this uncomfortable feeling of badness, which demands to be answered, we don't want to just leave it sitting there feeling like we are awful, horrible, wretched people, we scroll down in my example article and discover this heading when it switches. What can you do about extinction? Aha! Now there's something we can do. See, as this article has established, we may be bad people and are guilty of harming or participating in the harm to endangered animals and potentially their extinction. But if we try any of these simple, practical lifestyle changes as listed in detail on that side of the screen, we can actually help to save them instead. And this is where the second salvation happens, where we save ourselves from being guilty and bad by almost atoning for it with our actions, and also justifying ourselves now by action with participation in a good cause and participation in saving endangered animals. But you can see at this point, it's not really about the endangered animals so much as about getting rid of the guilt inside ourselves. And in a sense, we've shifted our place in the societal salvation also, from the ranks of the bad and the ignorant who are hindering the world's progress to the ranks of the good and informed who are taking one more step in the right direction. All is well. Until the next time. The information age, remember? Besides being a culture which encourages spreading information almost to excess, we also live in an age where we have the technology to be exposed to a lot of information. So if taking action determines, let's call them for the sake of a name, a moral identity, so whether or not we feel we are relatively good or bad people. If taking action determines or decides our moral identities, we're rapidly going to become overwhelmed because we have the ability to know about hundreds of problems. And with knowing about those hundreds of problems come hundreds of potentially actionable solutions. And these will rapidly get less actionable as they multiply. Obviously, we are limited by time, energy, resources, these things that make us human. So of course, by necessity, if we want to get rid of that guilt, and we can't do it by the direct answer guilt with action method that I described earlier, we're going to have to find other strategies. A lot of people just prioritize, especially researchers and presenters who pick one topic and put all their energies into that as their contribution to that societal salvation and as their way of feeling they're doing enough for the world. That's obviously not the only thing that's happening, but it is one element of it. Other known guilt coping strategies like repression, distraction, and denial crop up too. But however we might try to rationalize only partially saving ourselves, it can't really be secure, because how do we really know, logically, if we're doing as much as we possibly could? I mean, maybe there's something more that you could be doing and you aren't doing, maybe because you don't want to do it, and oh dear, the badness is back. We clearly feel more guilt than we can handle, and we can't save ourselves from all of it. Oh, and just to complicate things, there are kinds of guilt we can feel that don't even translate easily into action. For instance, here's an example. You can feel guilt for being part of a guilty group. For instance, the article I mentioned earlier, which was primarily about racial relations, made very good logical arguments for why guilt over the USA, especially's racial history, can apply to all white Americans, because all of them benefit off of the historical subject of African Americans, even if you don't hold actually racist beliefs. And the thing about group guilt, like in this example, is if you want to stop feeling guilty yourself, you can't stop being a member of that group. You have to take the guilt off the entire group before you can feel it off of yourself. And obviously that's difficult because we don't control an entire group of people, we just control us. So the best thing we can hope to do is push the whole group in the right direction and hope to get there eventually. For instance, by a kind of social awareness raising as described in several articles I read. Or you can be guilty of negligence or passivity. As part of my project, I read and analyzed a selection of random TED Talks, mostly because by looking for TED Talks, that was an easy way to find the kind of information I wanted. I read a selection of these and I annotated them for elements of my idea. And one of the things I noticed was when the speaker was describing why the audience was a part of the problem or why the audience needed to know about it, they used verbs like to accept or to allow. And these are a little bit squishier when you want to put them into action, to try and alter what we're accepting or allowing. Oh, and here's a fun one which is kind of related. You can be guilty of not knowing enough or of not having known about something already. One of the talks mentioned nobody seems to know about it as part of the reason it was a problem or part of the thing the audience was doing wrong. And that leaves us with a conundrum. What we've got to do to get rid of guilt we might have for not knowing about something in the future, we have to seek out any possible source of guilt we might be missing, and thus guilty of missing. And the thing about all of this guilt is it's often true. I was laughing at it a little bit, but not because it's wrong, only because it makes me a little dizzy thinking about it. Usually, in the cases we learn about, and barring, of course, false information, we are guilty of the consequences that may be described to us, like it or not. And I'm not saying we should run away from that guilt just because it burdens us. On the screen here is a little satire video I made as the other half of my project. You can see with Legos in stop motion because I'm a giant child. But the premise of this video was to be raising awareness about the dangers of raising awareness. And this video essentially concluded that nobody deserves to feel badly, and therefore nobody should ever tell us we are guilty of stuff. Obviously, it was using the very forms it was criticizing in order to make its point, or at least that's what I attempted to do, more or less successfully. But that's not where I want to land in my actual talk. And also, for good reasons, often the action that is suggested for us to take does need to be taken to solve the practical physical problem. So how do we reconcile all of this with the unlivable position excessive guilt leaves us with in practice? Over the course of my talk, I described two salvations that are present in our culture as related to information. The first, if you remember, is the societal one, where we essentially are engaged in a quest to save all of humanity from the evident evils present in the world and move into a better future, presumably with fewer and fewer evident evils, by means of often information and learning and making better choices. And this creates the conditions for the second one to happen. This creates the reason why information surrounds us and is such a big part of our lives and such a ubiquitous good in our culture. But the second salvation is then the one that happens inside us, where by our effort, or usually by action, we can save ourselves from feeling guilty about something we might be doing or not doing. And then by taking that action, bring ourselves to a point where we feel like we are good people instead of bad people. And whether or not you agree with the first one is more a matter of worldview. But I believe that the second one affects us across worldviews. I'm a Christian, and I believe that we are all guilty all the time, and probably of more things than we will ever discover if we try. I believe that nobody in here is blameless. And yet, I think at least some of us yearn to be blameless, to be free of guilt and badness and actually be good people. I know that I do. And so, if you are here and you feel burdened or like you will never live right or like you will never be able to read something and not feel guilty about it, then I don't want to point you to externalities like the general culture, like the person at the podium who's using persuasive strategies to make you feel guilty, like the worldviews of others. I believe that it would be unrealistic to try to change these things. And anyway, the search for salvation happens inside of us regardless of what's happening in the outside world. So if there's anything you take away from me today, it's to ask yourself if awareness and action really hold the power to accomplish the salvation you might be asking of them. Thank you.
All right. I want to thank you for making it to this moment of relief for all of us in Capstone this semester to have gotten through all of our talks. We really appreciate the support that you have showed for us this week, and it has been enjoyable for me as the teacher, sort of mixed emotions for our speakers. But I hope that you have had your thoughts provoked this week and have some new things to think about and maybe talk about as you leave this afternoon. So thank you for joining us. You can come back again next December to enjoy another round of TED Talks. Have a good rest of your afternoon. We just have one short little instruction from Mr. Roylance about Harbor Hall, and then we'll be finished.